Once you have thrown the dice in the air, you can't call them back. At that point, all you can do is wait until they land on the table to see what the numbers come up. And that is a very awkward time because you can just sit there on your hands and wait. There's nothing more you can do.
Schwarzkopf's plan called for the U.S. Marines to attack first, straight into Kuwait. He expected that would draw the elite Republican Guard into battle. 400 miles to the west, French and American airborne troops would begin encircling the battlefield. 24 hours later, Arab armies would support the attack into Kuwait. Only then would 7 Corps' heavy armor smash through the Iraqi defenses and race in a left hook across the desert to destroy the Republican Guard.
My nightmare scenario was that our forces would attack into Iraq and find themselves in such a great concentration that they became targeted by chemical weapons or some sort of a rudimentary nuclear device that would cause mass casualties. That's exactly what the Iraqis did in the Iran-Iraq War. They would take the attacking masses of the Iranians, let them run up against their barrier system, and when there were thousands of people massed against the barrier system, they would drop chemical weapons on them and kill thousands of people.
Schwarzkopf's plan meant that Walt Boomer, the Marine commander, would be the first to lead his men into action. Despite the air war, Boomer feared storming the minefields and barbed wire of southern Kuwait would be a murderous affair, fought under a barrage of Iraqi chemicals and nerve gas.
I was overwhelmingly concerned about casualties. We were outnumbered when we attacked into Kuwait. Sometimes people have lost sight of that. But in addition to being outnumbered, there was this overriding concern, overwhelming concern about chemical warfare. This just occupied most of my waking moments.
Beneath the smoke from the burning oil wells, Marine assault units pulled on the clumsy charcoal-lined suits that might save their lives in a chemical bombardment. There were predictions that the Marines could take as many as 10,000 casualties in a week of fighting.
Weather conditions were absolutely critical. And the weather predictions that we were getting at that time were very mixed. The Marines do not have a lot of heavy artillery and depend upon their aircraft to provide the close air support to replace the artillery. And Walt Boomer came to me and said he was very concerned about launching his attack when the weather was predicted to be so bad.
Schwarzkopf called Colin Powell in the Pentagon and asked that the ground war be delayed.
We have a president who is anxious to get this over with. And I went and talked to Norm on the phone and said, Norm, look, this is getting hard to explain. And I took him through why it was getting hard to explain, and he just had it. He exploded and said, you know, you do not understand my problem. You're talking in political terms. If you don't care about the lives of young people, well, I do. That did it. I exploded, and I started shouting back at him. You know, I care as much as you do, but there's a limit. And I have to work in both the political world and the military world. He said, Colin, I think I'm losing it. I feel my head's in a vice. I said, you're not losing it. If you have a total confidence, we got a problem. We'll work our way through this problem. And then about 30 minutes later, Norm called and said, oh, weather's fine. We can go.
On the Kuwaiti border, advanced teams of Marine engineers began to crawl through the minefields and barbed wire that protected the Iraqi front line. They used fiberglass rods to probe for mines, marking safe paths for the first troops to race through the next day.
You see mines everywhere. You can look left and right, and you see mines, half-buried mines, full-view mines. Just as far as you can see, you look left and right, and there's desert, and there's just lines and lines and lines, and groups of mines out there. We crawled. low crawled, which is on your belly, probing along with the fiberglass rods. 70 meters in front of you, Iraqis. Marine snipers are behind us trying to suppress Iraqis that are moving through the trench lines. You hear artillery, mortars, small arms.
Meanwhile, 17,000 Marines headed for the beaches of Kuwait City. But they weren't going to land. It was only a feint. Schwarzkopf had decided there would be too many U.S. casualties and had canceled the amphibious landing. But he still wanted the Iraqis to think it was coming. That night, 20 miles off the coast, the guns of the battleship Missouri shelled the beach to complete the deception. The Missouri had fought against the Japanese in the Pacific, and this was to be her last battle. The shells achieved their purpose. Iraqi troops moved toward the coast and away from the point the Marines would actually attack in the morning.
1st Marine Division will cross west of the Al Wafra in zone at approximately 01200 at H hour.
In the desert, the Marine commanders rehearsed their plans for the last time. They expected a tough fight.
While I remain apprehensive about some of their capability, I'm also confident that we can work through that. I think we can work through their chemical capability.
Before dawn, the attack began.
I don't think anyone predicted that the Marines would get much farther than maybe 5 kilometers. At the very most, maybe 8. And that then, with the enormous, overwhelming forces that were arrayed in that area, that it would stop the Marines.
We're going through the breach.
But by dawn, the generals realized something remarkable was happening. The Marine columns were driving right through the enemy positions.
Iraqi fighting positions.
While Allied aircraft watched for a counterattack, thousands of Marines poured into Kuwait, almost unopposed.
We expected casualties somewhere in the 25 to 30% range. But there were essentially no firefights, essentially no battles. The Iraqis were there, but they elected not to fight. In many respects, they could retreat and they could surrender much faster than we could attack or advance. And that the war really became a war of collection of enemy prisoners of war.
After 6 weeks of relentless bombing, half the Iraqi conscripts on the front line had already deserted. Those who stayed were just waiting for their chance to surrender.
Saddam said our young soldiers were behaving like women. They were turning into women. They weren't fighting like real men.
All right. You're all right.
This was not fair to our proud army. Our army did not believe in this war. It was a dirty war, this war in Kuwait.
The Marines waited for a chemical attack. It never came.
We didn't think that it was wise to use them. That's all what I can say, that it was not wise to use such kind of weapons in such kind of a war with such an enemy.
If chemicals had killed large numbers of Marines, the Pentagon had plans to flood Baghdad under 6 feet of water.
Knocking off the dams on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would have caused enormous destruction downstream. The loss of civilian life would have been terrible, and we really had not thoroughly analyzed. We knew how to hit the dams, but I don't know if we analyzed what the effect downstream would have been. But nevertheless, it would have been a good one to threaten the Iraqis with. And of course, there was always the implicit threat of nuclear weapons. I don't think we ever would have used them, but nevertheless, the Iraqis didn't know that. And we could have if provocation was serious enough.
Lay down your weapons, Phillips. We will not hurt you. We are here to help you.
In those first hours, 8,000 Iraqis were captured.
Be home soon.
The Iraqi collapse was so sudden, the Allied commanders didn't yet realize how their success could undermine the larger plan.
My own guess is that about 75% of them gave up and about 25% fought. As the day wore on, I began to become elated.
The Marines had advanced into Kuwait so quickly, the Republican Guard didn't come south to counterattack. And 7 Corps' left hook attack was not due until the following day. That would give the Republican Guard time to escape. Schwarzkopf had miscalculated. But had there been evidence weeks earlier of what might really happen when the Allies attacked the Iraqis? Had there been lessons to learn from the Battle of Khafji? After Saddam attacked the Saudi town in January and his forces were destroyed, some of Schwarzkopf's staff began to suspect the Iraqis simply couldn't stay in a fight with the Allies.
If he had read Khafji correctly and had come to the conclusion, as was obvious, that the Iraqis were not going to be able to fight effectively and would probably retreat, he could have done a number of things. He could have speeded up the army attack, or he could have held the Marine attack and let the army go first, which was one of the things that was recommended to him by one of his general officers. But he didn't. He never reassessed the situation after Khafji and continued to assume that the Iraqis were going to stand and fight.
As a young officer in Vietnam, Schwarzkopf had learned the dangers of underestimating the enemy. This time he had done just the opposite. He had overestimated the Iraqis, and now he had to act quickly.
I decided to move the main attack up to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It became obvious that if we were going to inflict that damage on the Republican Guard, we had to go ahead and inflict it as early as possible.
1, 2, 3.
A withering artillery and rocket barrage for the main attack, 7 Corps' left hook, began that afternoon. Seven Corps commander General Fred Franks, like many of the American generals, was a veteran of Vietnam. He'd lost a leg destroyed by a North Vietnamese grenade during the invasion of Cambodia in 1970. He was a careful, methodical man.
Memories of Vietnam are very sharp, clear to me. I mean, never far from my mind, and especially during the Gulf War. We didn't say it to each other, but I think we all felt that we're going to do it right this time.
Troops doing okay? Yes, sir. Good.
In many ways, Franks personified the Army after Vietnam. Maimed, traumatized. He was also a man who was constitutionally inclined to wait as long as he could before making a decision. One of his closest aides said he was a man who couldn't make the decision to pee if his pants were on fire. He was the kind of man who, by personal inclination, was not going to get along well with Schwarzkopf.
As the artillery barrage lifted, 7 Corps surged across the desert. This was the army that had been stationed in Europe to fight World War III. Now, the end of the Cold War allowed it to be unleashed against Iraq. The generals had expected 2 days of fighting to breach the Iraqi frontline defenses, followed by 6 days of massive tank battles with the Republican Guard.
I thought that we would lose somewhere between, in the breaching units, that we would lose somewhere between 20 and 40%.
The American 1st Infantry Division had the job of storming the trenches to clear a path for the tanks. To avoid hand-to-hand fighting, they planned to bury the Iraqi defenders alive.
A thought occurred to me, we could actually use these plows to fill in the trenches. In fact, I tested it myself. I got down in the ditch myself and had 2 tanks plow towards me just to see what it did. I learned several things. One is I learned that it happens very quickly. So the defender has a choice to make, but he has to make it very quickly. He can either give up and hop out of the trench, he can try to run down the trench and get away, but he better do those quickly because these things move at an amazing speed down there.
Along the Iraqi border ran a sand barrier, a berm. Beyond it lay 5 miles of minefields, and then the Iraqi trenches.
You got the first one, first berm in a minute. That's real good. The second one's a tougher one.
Armored bulldozers and tanks fitted with plows broke through the berm and moved onto the trenches. 18-year-old Joe Queen drove one of the lead bulldozers.
What we did is we just took the dirt that the Iraqi soldiers had dug out. You just push that dirt right back into the trench. You could just look at the man's eyes and see fear. You know, you see him scared. You know, you're looking at the whites of his eyes as you're going through in the trench with this bulldozer covering in the trench. And they were firing at the bulldozer. And the first bullet that hit the blade, that made me know then, hey look, this is for real. There's no game. Those are real bullets, and a bullet will kill you.
After the war, press accounts reported thousands of Iraqis were buried. Most independent analysts estimate it was just hundreds. The Army says it was about 150.
You don't think about, hey, what about this guy? What about that guy? He had a chance to get out. He had every opportunity to get out. And he took the way to die for his country, just like any American would.
First tank into Iraq!
By the end of the ground war's first day, all of Schwarzkopf's forces were on the attack.
I went to bed that night very satisfied with the fact that the campaign plan was unfolding and that it looked like we were going to have a terrific success on, and accomplish everything we wanted to accomplish.
In Washington that Sunday, President Bush had received little news. If there were heavy U.S. casualties, it could finish him politically and could even stop the war.
I got briefed just before I went into the church. The president was right ahead of me. I passed him a note that said, Mr. President, things are going very well. We all went back to the White House. I got out a map from Time magazine to sort of show him exactly what was happening. And I was able to tell him there that things were going extraordinarily well. We had assumed that the toughest part of the ground war in terms of casualties would have been the early hours of that conflict. And in fact, what we were finding was that the air war had been enormously effective and decimated the Iraqi forces, and that they, in fact, were collapsing in front of us.
But in Riyadh, the Allied commander was having a bad morning.
Schwarzkopf got up after a couple hours of sleep on the morning of the 25th and went in to look at the map in the war room, and he saw that the Marines were plunging ahead, that the 18th Airborne Corps out in the far west was plunging ahead. And then he looked and saw that 7th Corps basically had not moved since the time when he went to sleep. He completely and utterly lost his temper.
Just across the Iraqi lines, 7 Corps had stopped for the night. General Franks had decided there was too much danger of entangling his large force, of friendly fire, of too many casualties, if he continued the advance in darkness.
There's an old German saying that says, go slow now and go fast later. And so the scheme of maneuver, based on my own assessment and my discussions with the tactical commanders, my informant, my higher headquarters, that it would be actually faster. We would conduct the mission faster if we did not continue it during hours of darkness, but would continue it at first light.
I was repeatedly calling up my subordinate commander and telling him, we must attack, we must make contact with the enemy.